for the sleepy little baby, for the burger man get you.
Bites 2, using the Child Outcome Rating Scale. The Child Outcome Rating Scale was developed by Scott Miller and his team at the International Centre for Clinical Excellence as part of research efforts to develop highly feasible psychometric measures. And they produced 2 measures, the Child Outcome Rating Scale, that on the form says is suitable for 6 to 12-year-olds, and an adult version, the Outcome Rating Scale, that the form suggests can be used with older teens. However, the developers emphasise that you need to fit the measure to the young person rather than having rigid age cut-offs. And certainly in my experience over the last 8 or 9 years using the Child Outcome Rating Scale is that most teens are fine about using the Child Outcome Rating Scale. And at times when I've given them the choice, older teens tend to express a preference for the Child Outcome Rating Scale. There are other reasons for using the Child Outcome Rating Scale with teens that I'll come back to a bit later. But let's look at the forms themselves. They're made up of 4 questions that look at distinct domains of functioning. So first of all, how am I doing? How are things in my family? How am I doing at school and with friends? And how is everything going? And young people are asked to put a cross on the line. If things are going well, the cross is closer to the smiley face. If things aren't going so well, the cross is closer to the frowny face. One thing I do find when asking children and young people to fill this in, often they can say, oh well, things at school are different from things with friends. Now this question is not about academic achievement or popularity, it's about social functioning, how they work with others. And sometimes young people need that explaining. In terms of the adult version, the Outcome Rating Scale, the 4 domains are named in terms of personal well-being, family and close relationships, work, school and friendships, and a general sense of well-being. And people completing this form are asked to put a cross on the line closer to the right-hand side if things are going well, or closer to the left-hand side if things are not going so well. Now, one of the reasons why I prefer not to use this with young people is that if you look here, it uses the word interpersonally. And I'm not sure I would have understood that word at 13 or 14 or even 15. And certainly in my practice, I try and avoid using measures that have alienating language. So why bother with the Child Outcome Rating Scale? Well, we know that psychiatric diagnosis is a very poor predictor of response to treatment that's established in the literature. The rationale for the Child Outcome Rating Scale is that people do not seek or stay in services when they experience symptoms, but rather when those symptoms begin to impact on their functioning. And it's functioning that is the focus of the Child Outcome Rating Scale and the Outcome Rating Scale. There are other reasons for using the CAWS or the AWS. They assess areas of life functioning known to change as a result of therapeutic intervention, and that they're highly feasible measures. And by that it's meant that they're quick and easy to use, score and feedback live in session. And the research suggests they are popular with clinical staff and children and young people. And it's for these reasons that the CAWS and AWS are recommended as a measure for evaluating our interventions. Now, I won't go into detail about the psychometric properties of the AWS and CAWS, but according to Professor Tamimi, consultant psychiatrist, the Child Outcome Rating Scale has good enough psychometrics. So now, moving on to how we use the CAWS. In terms of introducing it to families, it's stating the obvious, but as with any health technology, before we invite any young people to use it, we require informed consent. And this involves giving a clear rationale. So the idea that the CAWS allows us to look at coping in different areas, And it also enables us to monitor any changes that may happen in the course of an intervention. And also that the child or young person has the option to refuse. It's also recommended that when you ask a young person to complete the course, that you may also ask their parent or carers to complete it as well. And when you introduce the course for the first time, it's important to set the expectation about how often it will be completed. Now, in my practice, the vast majority of young people will complete the course at the beginning, middle and end of an intervention, and also if there's been any breaks. However, a very small minority, I will use the course on a session-by-session basis. How I make that judgment depends on a number of factors that include my impression of the young person's preferences, the types of presenting problems, and the complexity of the context. But what I would suggest is, as you start to use the ORs and the CORs, try out various ways and frequencies of using them and see what suits your practice and the children and young people that you're working with. In terms of introducing the CORs to parents or carers, what you're asking them to do is to give their view on how the child or young person is doing. So don't get your mentalising knickers in a twist here. It's how the parent or carer sees the child that informs how they score the ORs or the CORs. It's not the parent or carer's prediction of what the child thinks or what they would put on the form, but about the parent or carer's point of view on the child's functioning. Now, there's a number of benefits to asking parents and carers to complete the ORs or the CORs. Multiple respondents increase their accuracy, and that's the reason parent completion is recommended by the developers. It can generate conversations about multiple perspectives, and I'll talk about that a bit later. And when child completion is inconsistent with your therapeutic modality, you can ask parents and carers to complete the ORs and the CORs prior to the intervention, at review, or at regular intervals to enable formal monitoring. Now, in terms of using the form itself, I tend to use it just visually, rather than inviting children and young people to get involved in the numbers game and what the numbers of the CORs mean. However, it's important that you do understand how to score the CORs, as it can inform judgments about severity and response to the intervention. So in terms of scoring the CORs, you need some technical equipment, namely a ruler. Then you need to check that each line on the form is 10 centimetres long. If it's not, due to a formatting problem or a printing problem, it will lose its psychometric properties. And then what you do is, for each line, you measure from the left-hand side to where the person has put a cross, and the distance in centimetres to 1 decimal place is the score for that line and that domain. Then you add up the length for each question and you get a total out of 40. So just to show you how this works, here we have a form that was completed by Joe, who is 14. And I'm just going to score up his form. So using the ruler, each length to 1 decimal place. Okay. Making sure the ruler sits properly on the line. And then I'm going to add them up using my calculator. You can do mental maths, but it's always best to be sure about your answers. And I'll just check that informally. And so here we have Joe, who's 14, scoring 25.4. Now, what does that mean? Well, we have some clinical cut-offs for the CORs. And what we see is that for children aged 12 years and under, the clinical cut-off, if they fill it in themselves, is 32, and if it's completed by their parent or carers, it's 28. And for 13 to 17-year-olds, if it's the same, if it's completed by the self or parent or carer, a cut-off of 28. So here we saw Joe, who was 14. He had a score of 25.4, so that is below the clinical cut-off and suggests his score is consistent with being in the clinical group. But let me explain a bit about what these clinical cut-offs mean. They're not diagnostic, they don't show that a child is ill. What they show is that their self-reported level of functioning is at a similar level to those who use services. So again, what I might say to Joe with his score of 25.4, scores at or above 28 represent young people who are plodding along all right in life and don't seek help. Young people who score below 28, and you've scored 25.4, are typically having some problems and want help making changes. Is that true for you? Now, for me, this question at the end is really important, as it can turn interpretation of measures into a collaborative exercise where the young person's views are valued. Okay. So again, if we use the cause in intervention, we might want to understand what a change in score might mean. So for example, if the score at the start of an intervention was 24 and at review was 31, what does this 7-point difference mean? Is it a change related to the intervention? Is it to do with statistical noise? Or what? Because what we know is that when a young person rates themselves, each time they rate, there might be small variations. We also know if a young person has a very high score or a very low score to begin with, over time they will tend to move towards the mean. So how big does the change in score need to be to give us confidence that it's clinically significant change, that the change is reliable? Now, fortunately, the statisticians have come up with a metric for reliable change called the reliable change criteria. And the reliable change criteria allows you to judge, as the man said, if it's change you can believe in. Now, it has this complex algorithm for working out the reliable change criteria, but in Scott Miller's original work, they found the reliable change criteria for the alls and the cause to be 5, and it's the same score if the young person completes the form or if the parent or carer completes the form. So when I look at changes on the cause in the course of a clinical intervention, a change of 5 or more is one piece of evidence to suggest that the change I'm observing is reliable and may well be connected with the intervention. However, what's more important than the numbers game, and as I said before, I rarely discuss the numbers with young people, I look at it visually. What's more important than the numbers is how we use the cause as part of our clinical conversations. Now, when I first started using the cause, I would get young people to complete it, and then I would get into my usual clinical conversations. What I've found over time, as I've developed my practice, is that I'm able to integrate the completion of the forms into the conversations that I have, and actually I found that they can support and help develop those conversations. And I'm just going to give you a few examples now. So, I often use the cause to help develop multiple perspectives, which can be really important in terms of framing and understanding why young people and their family are accessing an intervention. So what I would do at some point in that first meeting is get parents and the young person to complete the cause, and then looking at what they've marked, I would describe their similarities and differences. in how they've completed the form. Then I would ask the young person, and after that their parents, what surprises them and what's expected about the other's responses. And then I might invite the young person and then the parents and carers to say how they make sense of those differences and similarities. And what I've found over time is that for some families where difference can be experienced as problematic, looking at different scores on a form can be a contained way to talk about difference that opens up useful conversations for the work. One of the phenomena I often find is that a young person can rate the problem in quite a minimal way, and the parents can rate the problem in a much more significant way. And when that comes up on the cause, what that says to me is that the person with the lower score is often more invested in change. So if the parents are rating functioning much lower, that might be an indication to me that I start the work with the parents who will be more invested in change. The cause can also be useful in identifying goals. So after I've asked a young person to complete the cause, I might then ask them, if meeting with me was going to be helpful, which responses on the cause would you hope would change? Or again, looking at the form, I might say, if they did change, how would that show up in your life? What would be different as we start to get some detail about what change might look like? Another way of putting this is about what ideas do you have about what might help move your marks towards the smiley face? And in that way, I'm trying to engage with a young person's theory of change. A further way of using the ORs might be if I was in a meeting with a parent or carer and I was concerned about their mental health or their well-being, I might invite a parent to complete the ORs about themselves, and that could be the basis of a conversation for signposting or referring to support services. I also find the cause really helpful at review meetings. So what I might do is get out the calls that somebody completed at the beginning, middle and end, put them before the young person, and then ask them to notice what's changed and what hasn't changed. Now you could plot these on a graph if you've got time, or you just use it visually in the room. And having invited a young person to look at the changing scores, I might ask them to name what's changed and what's stayed the same. And once we've done that, then we can start to get into a young person's and the parents' theory of change. How come these differences have emerged? What's enabled them? And as well at review, the scores on the course can be used to inform post-discharge planning and setting goals or tasks in relation to that. Supervision is key to developing practice around the cause, and I think supervision generally is central to the meaningful use of feedback tools. One way you can use the cause is it can help identify cases for discussion. So, for example, where the feedback from a young person about sessions is positive, but the cause score is dropping, that might be a reason to take the case to supervision for discussion. Supervision is really important to support experimentation and curiosity and developing your practice around measures. We have discovered that there are various stages to using feedback tools and outcome measures. At first they can seem quite annoying, then they can be a bit awkward, and then as we start to experiment with them, we find ways of integrating them into our practice that can actually support our practice. And I think that supervision is really important for that process. Supervision can also help us keep in touch with the limitations of measures and feedback tools, and reminding us that it's just one source of evidence that we might look at against other forms of feedback and other knowledge that we've learned about the young person and their families. The cause can also be useful for spotting off-track interventions and predicting dropout when scores are declining or not changing. So, to summarise, The NHS requires us to use psychometric measures. In CAMHS, we're really keen to use measures in a meaningful and clinically informed way, and that the course is quick and simple to complete and score, live in session. It's a useful intervention measure that can be applied to a range of therapeutic modalities, and that supervision is essential to supporting experimentation and curiosity.